to Abram and have a child through her, and Ishmael is born, and there's all sorts of issues that came up along with that, and some of that is going to continue to linger. We're going to kind of talk about as it goes on. The one thing I do want to bring up is that Abram is 86 years old when Ishmael is born, and then between chapter 16 and chapter 17, there is a 13-year gap where we're not told about anything that happens. Surely there were things going on, but not enough of any significance for us that it was recorded. That does not mean that the Bible is making mistakes. It's just we need to recognize there is a period of time between those two chapters. So when we get to chapter 17 here, Abram, of course, is 99 years old. That makes Ishmael 13. And that would make Sarah about 89 years old also. So that kind of gives you a time elapse here. And one thing I do want to note before we kind of get back into our study, with that gap, we just mentioned it here, the 13-year gap between chapter 16 and 17. I think it's good for us to note now, because this is probably going to come up later, so I'm going to mention it now. Chapters 17 through 21 all kind of happened within a year's time. So a whole bunch of stuff is about to happen in a very short period of time, whereas like we would get just snippets, every couple of years of things happening. But chapters 17 through 21, from what I understand, the text implies and indicates for us is that it's all happening within the span of a year. We're kind of helped along by that because we know when Isaac is born and all that, so it kind of makes it very obvious for us. But there's going to be mentions along the way of what is going on at the time and who's how many years old and things like that. So when we look at chapters 17 through 21, this is all happening in a very short period of time. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go through, even though it seems like maybe a long time is passing because we're going through a bunch of chapters, it's actually a very short period of time in comparison to what we've been reading up to now. So I thought I wanted to mention that real quick. We did start chapter 17 where we see, we get a mention of Abram's age at the beginning there. So we know kind of where we are time-wise. I've just kind of talked about that. We have God, again, telling Abram his promises. He's going to have a bunch of nations come through him. It's going to be all great. And we're going to kind of talk about that more as we go. And then we have God doing something that's important, at least in when I'm doing my notes. He's no longer going to be called Abram. It's now Abraham. So now that I got used to typing Abram in my notes, now I got to get back to getting used to typing Abraham in my notes. Because I mentioned this last week. As soon as God says your name is Abraham now, he is always referred to as Abraham. Always, like 100% of the time. Unlike when we see other name changes or people who are known by other names like Jacob becomes Israel, he's still usually called Jacob after that. I mean, you'll get a couple of times where he's called Israel, but he's still usually called Jacob, which we kind of talked about how that's interesting. I don't really have much more to say about that, but it's very clean cut here in the midst of this chapter. It's no longer Abram, it is Abraham, and it is going to be that way for the rest of time. And then, God continues to talk about, great nations that come from you. You're going to be the father of many, which is the reason he's giving this name change. And let's see, is there anything else that we talked about? He does talk about how he was going to give the descendants of Abraham this promised land, and that certainly is fulfilled. But one of the things that God modified, or I don't know if modified is the word, he was more specific about was the requirements of staying in the promised land. We looked at passages in Deuteronomy chapter 28 and 1 Kings chapter 9 where God tells the Israelites that you have to continue to walk in my ways and be faithful and do the right thing, and then you will stay in the land. But if you don't, the opposite is going to happen. You're not going to stay in the land. You'll be destroyed. Especially the instance in 1 Kings chapter 9 when he's talking to Solomon, a descendant of yours will always be on the throne unless you don't walk in my ways and you go on, you do your own thing. He makes a very specific point that not even this temple that you've built, because that's kind of the context, is they've just built this temple and dedicated it. He says, even though this temple is here, that's not going to protect you from, devastation if you decide to desert me. Which in the time of Jeremiah, we see some of the people saying, well, the temple of the Lord is here, surely nothing bad is going to happen to us. But literally in the time of Solomon, God said that was not going to be the case. So, we pick and choose what we want to understand, I guess. That kind of still goes on today. So that's as far as we got last week. So we're ready to start verse 9 of chapter 17. Any further comments that we need to make before we continue on through this chapter? All right. I just want to catch us all up to speed because last week was just a long time ago. So sometimes I need the reminder. Okay. Let's go ahead and start reading then. Someone read for us Genesis chapter 17, verses 9 through 14, please.
Then God said to Abram, "As for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come. This is my covenant with you and your descendants after you. The covenant you are to keep. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You are to undergo circumcision, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or bought with money from a foreigner, those who are not your offspring." How far?
Through 14, please.
Okay. Whether born in your household or bought with your money, they must be circumcised. My covenant is your flesh. In your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. Any circumcised male who has not been circumcised, any uncircumcised male who has not been circumcised in the flesh will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant.
Okay, thank you. So we're kind of getting into maybe the main point of this chapter is including, because, the Bible includes things that we need to understand as we go. So if there's a 13-year gap, there's nothing we need to know. But there's a detail here, not just for us, but especially for the people of the Old Testament, something that they would need to know is, why do we do this? I'm not going to get into all the details. I'm not going to get graphic about circumcision or anything like that. Ask your parents. But there are some details I do want to discuss here about this. He instructs Abraham that the sign of this covenant, the sign of this promise between them is going to be circumcision of all males in his house. And that it's not just Abraham's blood descendants, but everyone in his household who is a servant or slave, everyone that is included within basically his party, if you will, the group that he's with, need to all be circumcised. Now, I don't really have a lot of thoughts about why this particular thing God asked for, because God could have done anything. Why did he choose this? I don't really have a lot to discuss about that, but I do want to look at some of the instances, because we looked at the end of the reading here we just had, where it talks about God would cut off people who are not circumcised, being violators of the covenant. And then I want to go into what the New Testament says about what the circumcision is about. And maybe that will give us maybe some more information about what we're looking for. But before we do that, let's go to some examples where this did happen. I got 3. Someone go to Genesis chapter 34, verses 14 through 17. Someone else go to Exodus chapter 4, verses 25 and 26. And then the last one will be from Joshua chapter 5, verses 2 through 9. And we'll read them in that order. So whoever's got it, go ahead and read for us Genesis 34, verses 14 through 17, please.
And they said to them, "We cannot do this thing, to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us. But on this condition we will consent to you. If you will become as we are, if every male of you is circumcised, then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people."
All right. I think that. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Go through 17. I'm sorry.
"But if you will not heed us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter and be gone."
Okay. We've mentioned this story in the past before. Again, I'm not going to get into too much detail, but a little bit of context is Shechem has basically violated Dinah, the daughter of Israel, of Jacob. And basically, they're trying to say, well, let's just get married and we'll just be one people, we'll unite. And the issue here is circumcision, is the people who are with Shechem are not circumcised males. And so the sons of Jacob are saying, well, we can't do this. We can't become one nation because you're not circumcised. So they've gone on. They've been very serious about this covenant. There's a whole other thing that goes on with this. I'm not going to get too much into it. It's a very fascinating story. But they are keeping to this promise. Like, they are still in it. We're a couple generations away from Abraham, but they are very much honoring this tradition. Now, there may be a side reason too as why they're also imposing this, but they're at least claiming it. So I'm going to give it that at least. Next one, Exodus chapter 4. Someone read verses 25 and 26, please.
Then Zipporah took a sharp stone and cut off the foreskin of her son and cast it at Moses' feet, and said, "Surely you are a husband of blood to me." So he let him go. Then she said, "You are a husband of blood because of the circumcision."
Okay, so I guess I should include a little bit of context for this one as well. In this particular section, God is about to kill Moses. And you're like, wait, what? But it's a short detail that we get in here because Moses had not circumcised his son. So his wife goes ahead and takes care of that. But God was planning to kill Moses because of the violation of this covenant. So again, God is taking this very seriously, the idea of cutting off those who do not adhere to this sign of the covenant. Last one, Joshua chapter 5, verses 2 through 9, please.
At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, "Make flint knives for yourselves and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time." So Joshua made flint knives for himself and circumcised the sons of Israel at the hill of the foreskins. This is the reason why Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war who died in the wilderness on the way after they had come out of Egypt. For all the people who came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness on the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. For the children of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness, till all the people who were men of war who came out of Egypt were consumed, because they did not obey the voice of the Lord, to whom the Lord swore that he would not show them the land which the Lord swore to their fathers that he would give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Then Joshua circumcised their sons, whom he raised up in their place, for they were uncircumcised, because they had not been circumcised on the way. So it was, when they had finished circumcising all the people, that they stayed in their places in the camp till they were healed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "This day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from you. Therefore the name of this place is called Gilgal to this day."
So this is really interesting here. We've talked about this several times. When the people came out of Egypt in the Exodus, that entire generation died out. We've talked about the reasons why and their unfaithfulness and all the things that happened with that. But the generation that came out, that was born in the wilderness, and we're just continuing on, and we're going to go into the promised land, for whatever reason, have not been circumcised up to this point. Now, why that would be seems kind of weird, because it should be the 8th day. Every male who was born should have been circumcised as they went. But that apparently did not happen. And so here in Joshua, they're rectifying that. But it is just kind of a weird thing that, did no one think to do this? Did no one in the priesthood think to enforce this? I don't really have answers for why that is the case, but it was something that God pointed out is, you're not keeping the sign of the covenant that I made with Abraham way back here in Genesis chapter 17. And God also, again, was taking that very seriously. It's just weird that had been the case. So anyway, I just wanted to go to those chapters, those sections of verses to show that this was something that was serious, something that was taken seriously. And the descendants of Abraham were expected to do this. Now, I want to go to some New Testament verses that talk about the circumcision. And what we're going to see is, and this is just a general statement before we get into them, is you're going to see the idea of circumcision showing, oh, I'm part of the covenant with God, I'm one of the chosen, but in a spiritual way and not a physical way. Let's go to, I got 5 verses I want to go to. So I'm going to go to Romans chapter 2. and you'll read 25 through 29. Someone else go to Romans chapter 4, verses 9 through 14. Another person go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 18 through 19. Then the fourth one will be Galatians chapter 6, verses 12 through 15. And then the last one will be Colossians chapter 2, verses 9 through 14. And we'll go in that order as well. So the first one, whoever has it, Romans chapter 2, verses 25 through 29, please.
For circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law, but if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if you fulfill the law, judge you who even with your written code of circumcision are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God.
Okay, so there's quite a bit in here that the verse I especially want to focus on, the last two verses, but especially verse 29. Paul goes here into the circumcision of the heart. Now, again, this is not a physical circumcision. He is not telling you, okay, it's time for open heart surgery. Go in there and cut off a piece of the heart. No, that's not what he's saying. He's talking about those who have committed themselves to God, who are showing the sign of the covenant between them and God spiritually, have this with them. They are one who is inwardly righteous, inwardly a child of God. Not just a physical outward sign that says, "Hey, look, I'm a descendant of Abraham. I'm one of the chosen people. Therefore, I must have a connection to God because of this physical outward sign." Paul's saying that's not going to be the thing that saves you. It's going to be, what is your soul doing? What is your connection to God? As far as, what is your spiritual condition, not just your physical condition. I have a funny story about verse 29 especially. It's not really related to anything. I just think it's funny. My father used to be a bus driver, and for a while he was a bus driver for a Hebrew academy where we lived in California. We have a pretty big Jewish population out there. And they had some field trip or something, and they wanted to make sure that, I think it was falling on a holiday, a Jewish holiday of some kind, they wanted to make sure that none of the bus drivers that were sent on this were Jewish so that they could observe the holiday. And so they came to my father and asked, "Well, are you Jewish?" And he quotes this here, verse 29, he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And then suddenly there was a panic because they didn't know he was Jewish and they're trying to find another bus driver for him. And he had to kind of explain to him what he meant by that. But, they were trying to be nice, I guess. But this is something that would certainly be different from the old law way of thinking is, I'm a descendant of Abraham. I have this sign of circumcision. It's a very physical thing. It shows, it's proof that I'm, one who is with God. But Paul is saying it's not the physical that matters. It is your spiritual condition that matters. Are you circumcised in the heart? Does your heart show that you are one who is from God? We're going to see kind of similar things as we go. Romans chapter 4, verses 9 through 14. Whoever has that, please.
Is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? We have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after but before. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So then, he is the father of all who believe but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them. And he is also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. It was not through law that Abraham and his offspring reached
Okay, that's good. Thank you. We've actually, I think we've referenced this verse before earlier in the study. I think kind of the main points to take out of here is, when did Abraham receive promises from God? It was before chapter 17 of Genesis. Now, we see that included in chapter 17, but if you go, I think it's basically from 12 all the way to this point, God has over and over again promised these things to Abraham, and we've been told in chapters before this that Abraham was considered righteous, and his belief in God was considered, was credited to him as righteousness, his faith was. So Paul's point here is that it's not because he was a man of circumcision or a man of the law, it was because of his faith, not because of who he was physically or because he had some sort of doctrine that he was following. It was because he had faith in God. Now, that would be very much, kind of a new thing to the Jews that he would be writing to, who have been, they've been circumcised, they've been following the law their whole life, and now they're being told, that's not going to be the thing that saves you. It's going to be your faith in God. It's going to be how you act and interact with God on a spiritual level, which it's more than just, again, the physical outward signs. Next verses, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 18 through 19, please. 1 Corinthians 7, verses 18 through 19.
Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God.
Okay, so there of course is a bit larger context of here of the condition of which a person was when they became a follower of Christ, and in here one of the things he says is it doesn't matter whether you were circumcised or uncircumcised. That it literally doesn't matter. That's what he says. It means nothing. It's keeping the commandments of God that matter. So that one's pretty short and sweet. Next one, Galatians chapter 6. Verses 12 through 15, please. Galatians 6, 12 through 13.
As many as desire to make a good showing in the flesh, these would compel you to be circumcised, only that they may not suffer persecution for the cross of Christ. For not even those who are circumcised keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised, that they may boast in your flesh. But God forbid that I should boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything, but a new creation.
Okay, so again, we have similar points here in Galatians chapter 6. Circumcision or non-circumcision doesn't matter. And he kind of, before that point, is saying there are people who are trying to convince you that this is necessary, but it's not. He basically makes that point. Last one, Colossians chapter 2, verses 9 through 14. This will be the last one we'll go through. Colossians 2, verses 9 through 14, please.
For in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and you are complete in him, who is the head of all principality and power. In him you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of sins of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you, being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he is made alive together with him, having forgiven you all your trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross.
Okay, so there's more in this chapter, but what I want to pull out of this is he talks about a circumcision not done by hands. What is he talking about here? What is Paul writing about? Yeah, a circumcision of the heart, like we've read earlier, but he then talks about how this is the burial and baptism. He talks about how this is putting off the body of sins of the flesh by a circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you were raised with him through faith. Again, there's faith in there. faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead. So again, it's not what is the physical condition of your body. It is, do you have faith in God to follow his commandments, to do what he has asked you to do? Not, am I a descendant of Abraham? Am I of the law? Am I circumcised or not? So the New Testament is giving a very different view than what we had in the Old Testament. There is a promise that God had in the Old Testament with Abraham, but that covenant is not fulfilled in a different way in the New Testament. It is not about my physical condition. It is, am I following God in faith as Abraham did? Am I buried with Christ in baptism, as the New Testament explains over and over again? Have I been circumcised in my heart, in my spiritual service to God, rather than just a physical outward sign? So I wanted to get a lot of verses on this because it's easy for us to get tied up on, do we need to be circumcised? Do we not? Paul over and over again says it doesn't matter. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have any, one way or the other, it doesn't have any sway on your spiritual connection to God. It's your faith, it's your obedience to God where that matters. Any comments? I know we kind of went through a bunch of them real quick. Any comments or thoughts on any of that we just read through? Go ahead, Jeff.
There's a trap that we fall into sometimes that is very similar to what the Jews fell into, and that is thinking that because they're circumcised, that made them righteous. But if circumcision was to represent that they devoted their heart to God, that's what it was supposed to represent, not just the fact of the circumcision. So sometimes we think that we're baptized, and because we're baptized, because of the fact of the baptism, we're righteous. But it's supposed to indicate that we've given our heart to God, that we put away the old man to put him to death, and that we put Jesus on the throne of our heart. If we haven't done that, it doesn't matter that we got done.
Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of things we could actually apply this to where, Christians might divide within the church. I was raised in the church, or I was baptized very early in life compared to those who may have been baptized later in life or weren't raised in the church. Those divisions should not exist. Those divisions should not apply. When a person has devoted themselves to God and remain faithful to God, that's what matters. I don't think anywhere in the Bible we're going to say, well, so-and-so was around for a lot longer, so they should get some better reward. In fact, we have, in our Wednesday night class, gone through a parable. This is kind of the opposite of that, is everyone's going to get the same reward as long as they're faithful to God. That's another study. I'm not going to get into Jeff's lessons for him. Very good. Any other comments before we continue on in chapter 17 of Genesis? Okay. I think I threw enough verses out there that it makes it pretty obvious where the Bible was going with this. Even if I don't necessarily understand it completely, the Bible makes it a lot easier for us now. So let's go back to Genesis 17. Maybe we'll finish the chapter. We'll see. Someone read for us Genesis 17, verses 15 through 22, please.
Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her and also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old, that Ishmael might live before you? Then God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time set next year. Then he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham.
Okay, thank you. So Abraham is not the only one getting a name change here. His wife Sarai is now going to be called Sarah. And from this point on, she is Sarah pretty much every time after this. We're not going to see her referred to as Sarah again. And for a similar reason is because many nations are going to come from her, is what is told. Now, someone might look at what is said by Abraham here in verse 17, where he says, am I going to have a child at 100 years old? Is she going to bear a child at 90 years old? And think that maybe Abraham's got his math wrong here, because we're clearly told at the beginning of the chapter he's 99, he's not 100. But if you think about it, even if she conceives almost immediately, it's going to take 9 months for that child to be born. So it's going to take almost a year. So he's adding that year on. That's not a mistake. That's Abraham knowing what the math is there. But just for the sake of us, imagine having your child at 100 years old or 90 years old. To us, that's crazy. Now, people still had longer lifespans back then. If we go through the generations that we have recorded for us, we know that they were still living a little bit longer. But even still, again and again, we've been told, even before this chapter, that they're in the mind of the world at the time, they're too old to have kids. Like, this is something that would not happen even in their time. So this is not something that is common. This is not something that everyone sees all the time. This is something that is exceedingly rare, to the point that it never happens, which again is why this is so miraculous, is because this thing does not happen physically, naturally, ever, which is why this is something that God is bringing about through his power. Now, Abraham, and I kind of mentioned maybe last week about kind of my feelings on Abraham as a father, and we're probably going to talk about this again later. But Abraham asked if Ishmael could be the son of this blessing, or the son of this promise. Maybe in two ways. Maybe he just thinks it would be easier. This would make more sense. He's already around. He's 13. But God is going to say, like, no, this is not how it's going to be. God says that, Ishmael, he's going to have his own greatness. He's going to have his own descendants. And we've talked about this already back, I think last week, or maybe the week before, in Genesis chapter 25, verses 17 through 18, after the death of Abraham. It gives us a list of Ishmael's descendants. He has 12 sons and a daughter, just like Jacob has 12 sons and a daughter. And there are many nations and peoples today that claim heritage to Ishmael. So it's not like Ishmael was kind of sidelined and it's like, well, too bad, you're not the one that we wanted. He gets his own allotment, but it's not the one that God has promised to Abraham as far as what he's been promising since chapter 12 of Genesis. So it's not that promise, but Ishmael is going to be taken care of. And we're going to see that later on too, as we go through Genesis, especially after Isaac is born, what the fate of Ishmael and his mother Hagar is going to be. And I have some pretty good thoughts on that. I'm going to save them for when we get to those chapters. So he's going to have a son. Abraham is going to have a son by Sarah, and they're going to name him Isaac. And of course, this is going to happen in about a year. And then we have this interesting phrase, and we're going to see it several times, where when God is finished speaking with Abraham, he just goes up from him or he goes away from him. This comes up again a couple times. I don't really know how that works. Again, this is the age of the patriarchs, where God is speaking directly to people like Abraham. And I imagine it's similar to the way he probably spoke to the prophets. But we don't really know for sure how that works. But whatever Spirit of God or the presence of God that was there goes away from Abraham after this conversation is over. It's just kind of an interesting thing that we probably won't totally wrap our minds around in this life. But we do see that several times here and also later. That's about all I have to say about those verses. Any comments on up to verse 22 here?
You might remember that Sarah's plan for Hagar, and it's kind of parallel to our traditions and customs. They had their plan, and it was not, God never said that this was sin. What they did actually follow the common custom of the day, and God overlooked the multiple wives in many circumstances. And Hagar actually became like a wife to Abraham in many ways. But it's kind of parallel to our customs. We have to be careful that whenever our customs come up against what is best for fulfilling God's will, then our
And we talked about this a little bit when we went through chapter 16. Abraham had been told he would have a son, but he was not told it would be by Sarah until this point in chapter 17, where God makes that extremely clear that Sarah is going to be the one to bear the child of promise. They were not told that. So Sarah has this idea, or Sarai at the time, if you will. She has this idea, and we're gonna do this thing that was, like as you said, not an uncommon thing to do. And it goes how she planned, but then she's mad about how it goes. We talked about that too, how she's not happy how Hagar kind of gets a status upgrade in this way, and there's this whole drama between the two of them. I'm not sure if that really ever gets totally settled. In fact, it probably doesn't. We're going to see some indications later that there's still some friction between those two. But God had a way that man could not understand and man could not plan himself. And I think that's not just the miraculous part about this, but God showing that he is faithful, that he's always going to follow through, because he does. We're going to see that later. And all the times we've talked about the promises, we get to go and we can see later, hey, he fulfilled that promise. Hey, he fulfilled that promise. He's faithful, and he's going to do it in a way that we don't always expect. A lot of times when we pray for a certain outcome or for something to happen, sometimes the answer is just no, and we have to be okay with that. But sometimes the answer is yes, but not in the way we want it to be. Some people, there's that phrase, be careful what you ask for, you might get it. Well, you might get it, and it might be not necessarily what you thought it would be, or it won't have the outcome that you expected. We just got to be very careful about that. We should never think that God is not listening to us, or that God has abandoned us. Just sometimes God has a different idea, and we need to be okay with that. Arnold, you had your hand up earlier. Go ahead.
Yeah, just along those lines, what you just said, God, listen. In verse 20, he tells us that, I heard your concerns about Ishmael, but don't worry, I'm gonna take care of it. But, and Abraham's reaction is one of a father, that is his son, he wants the best for him.
Yeah, and I guess I'll get into it a little bit. I'll show my hand a little early. But I get the impression from every interaction that Abraham has with God concerning Ishmael, he really seems to care about Ishmael. We tend to kind of like put him off to the side because he's not the son of the promise. But Abraham did love Ishmael. I have no doubt about that, because he asked, can Ishmael be part of this promise? When eventually that he is sent away, he's distraught about it. He doesn't really know what to do. And God has to kind of be there and say, like, Abraham's going to be okay. I'm going to take care of him for you. Because it seems that Abraham just wants to take care of his son. He seems to love him. He's always concerned when things aren't going well for Ishmael. So I think, if there's an example of a good father in the Bible, Abraham is probably a good father. We don't get a ton of details, but the times we do, despite all the things that are going on, he seems to really care and want the best for his son. Even if it's not the chosen son, the promised son that God had in mind, it's still his son. So I think that's something to be commended. And God recognizes that, Abraham, you're trying to do the right thing, and I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to help you along. So there's definitely some good things in there, despite maybe not the best situation. Abraham's really trying to be a good dad, it seems. I think that's about all I have for these. Anything else before we move on to the last set of verses? All right, let's wrap up real quick. Someone read for us verses 23 through 27, please.
So Abraham took Ishmael his son, all who were born in his house, and all who were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very same day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very same day Abraham was circumcised, and his son Ishmael, and all the men of his house, born in the house, or bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him.
Okay, so I mean, Abraham does what God asks. I think that's just the obvious thing to get out of these verses. But I think one of the other things, the other details we need to pay attention to is he does it the same day. There's no waiting around. There's no, well, okay, God said this. Let's think about how we want to do this. He just goes and does it the same day. There's no hesitation. Again, one of the great things about Abraham, when God tells him to do something, he just goes and does it. You know, it gets frustrating when you look at some of the children of Israel where God tells them to do something and they just, for whatever reason, they don't want to do it. But so often, over and over again, Abraham does it. When Abraham is called to go from Haran down to the promised land, he does it. When he's told, circumcise all the men of your house, he does it. When he's told later, sacrifice your son Isaac, he goes and he does it. Like, there's no hesitation. There's no waiting around. He is not always understanding. We know that. He doesn't always know why God is doing this, and he doesn't always see the big picture, but he does it anyway. And I think that is such a great example because all of the time in our struggles, we're not going to see the big picture all the time. We're not going to understand, well, why is God letting this happen to me? Or, why is God not answering the prayer in the way I want him to? And we just got to go and do the work. When God says you got to go and do this, you just do it. And not worry about, well, why is God doing it this way? Abraham goes and does it. That's such a great example because we always want to try to outthink what God is trying to do for us or justify ourselves in some way. Abraham just does it. So very noteworthy, very good example. That's about all I have to say about that. Again, we're told he's 99, Ishmael's 13. And like I said before, chapters 17 through 21 are all going to occur in about a year's time. So as we go through the next several chapters, they're kind of happening one after the other. This is very rapid succession as we go through. But that's all we have time for today. Any comments, any further questions before we close study for this morning?
Your comment about Abraham just doing God's will, that's the Bible definition of faith. Abraham was willing to believe anything God told him and do anything God commanded him without asking questions. And that's Romans 4 says that's our example of faith.
And in Hebrews 11 also, it says, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, Abraham obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. He didn't really know what to expect. He didn't know what he would find, but God told him to do it, so he just did it. And so he's in that hall of faith, if you will, in Hebrews 11. So very good. Next week, we will begin chapter 18 of Genesis. Again, the next several chapters are going to be quick succession in time. We are going to get to the point very soon where it talks about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham is going to kind of be in the background for a little bit, and it's going to be more focused on Lot. We're still going to go through that because some of what Abraham does is related to that destruction, so I'm not going to cut it out completely. And we'll talk about Lot a little bit and kind of his life, where he ends up, just maybe as a side detour, but then we'll get right back to Abraham after that. And we're kind of getting toward the end. Chapter 25 is the end of Abraham's life, so we've not got too many more chapters to go. We're about halfway as far as that goes. So we're getting into his latter times. So with that, we're close for the day, and we'll pick up chapter 18.